The best time to have a smoothie is in the summer. The worst time to have a smoothie is in the winter, especially if you tend towards like sinus congestion, mucus in your system. I would just avoid smoothies altogether, which I know is hard because especially people who have a lot going on like me, it's really good to just like throw some healthy food in a blender and pop out the door. But I think it's a good lesson on taking time to really prepare food for yourself, to sit down, indulging in a meal that maybe takes a little bit longer to make.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Sivana family. Welcome back to the show. I'm super excited for today's episode, which is all about one of my favorite topics, Ayurveda. Even if you've listened to Ayurvedic podcasts that we've done in the past, or you know a lot about Ayurveda like me, you are going to love the juicy, actionable tips that our expert shares in today's episode. I'll introduce her in a moment. Before I do, I just wanted to quickly remind you of the 2 ways that you can support the show. Number 1 is by leaving a rating or review here on iTunes. And number 2 is by purchasing something at SivanaSpirit.com. SivanaSpirit.com is an online shop for yoga clothing, healing jewelry, and unique spiritual fair trade gifts. And more than that, what you may not know is that Sivana is a family-owned business. It was founded by 2 brothers, and when they were traveling together in India, they witnessed the incredible hardships faced by children growing up in impoverished communities in India. And wanting to help, they created Sivana, and the company also helps tackle vitamin A deficiency disorder in suffering children. So the idea is that by selling this spiritual jewelry, purposeful fashion, and fair trade items from around the world, that they can also support children in India. And when you're making a purchase on SivanaSpirit.com, you're not only supporting this podcast, you're supporting a family-owned business, and you're supporting this larger social mission. I'm a huge fan of everything they're doing, and I want to make sure that you use that code podcast30 for 30% off your first order. Now, introducing today's guest, her name is Izzy Adair. She is a certified birth doula and postpartum doula. We're going to talk to her a little bit more about everything birth related on Thursday. But today we're focused on Ayurveda, and she's also an Ayurvedic Wellness Counselor and student of Anthropology. What we're going to go over today is really fun basics. What foods are pitta aggravating, Vata provoking, what's good for balancing kapha, and we're also going to cover some things that I've always wanted answers to, like what's the deal with coffee in Ayurveda? Do we need to ditch smoothies, which is one of my favorite things? Do we need to be vegan to practice Ayurveda? And what's the difference between a yogic diet and an Ayurvedic diet? Izzy's going to walk us through all of this. Let's dive into the interview. Hi, Izzy. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to the show. And we're going to talk so many things about Ayurveda today. But one of the things I thought we could kick off with that I know I got so excited to bring you on the show to talk about was this idea of Ayurveda and sustainability, and how through practicing Ayurveda, we're actually also contributing to a sustainable lifestyle. Can you tell the listeners a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think there's a common misinterpretation that Ayurveda means specifically living with Eastern herbs and eating an Eastern diet. But actually, Ayurveda recommends living in your own environment. So that means eating the plants that grow in your local environment, eating the herbs that grow within your local environment, as well as eating the seasons. Because the idea is that your vikriti, your imbalance, changes on your environment. So whatever imbalance you have is going to be in part to your local environment, and our local environment will actually grow the foods that help bring us into balance. Like if you think of summer, which is super pitta aggravating, there's a lot of fire, a lot of heat. You get all these delicious, ripe, juicy fruits and cucumbers and melons and things that have a lot of water. So they have this ability to bring us back into balance if we're eating the foods that naturally are in season.
Interesting. So I want you to tell us more about this particular idea. You use some words like prakriti and vakriti. Most of the Sivana listeners are pretty familiar with Ayurveda, but do you want to define some of the key terms and maybe just say what Ayurveda is at a most basic level, just as a review or for people who are new to this?
Yeah, of course. So I look at Ayurveda as a way to connect with the natural rhythms of the universe and of your environment. When you're born, based on your DNA, based on your karma, you have a prakriti, which is your natural state of balance of the elements existing within your system. This is ether, air, water, earth, and fire. As you grow up, as you live, as you experience changes, traumas, as you move around from city to city, from country to country. And just as you grow in general, your body naturally strays away from this prakriti and you end up moving towards a vikriti, an imbalance. And your vikriti can also change from year to year, from season to season, based on a variety of elements, including where you are, what's happening in your life, what's going on in your spiritual, emotional state, what's happening in your external environment, like the heat, the dryness, fatigue.
So it sounds like this practice of Ayurveda is trying to get back to your prakriti, right? It's like the journey back to your prakriti from your vikriti. And then what you're saying is that the environment using or eating locally, for example, helps us do that. So coming back to the example of it's summer and there's tomatoes and cucumbers, following this train of thought, it's that these tomatoes and cucumbers are the exact foods that we should be eating during the pitta season of summer in order to come more into balance, in order for our vikriti to move towards our prakriti. Is that right?
Yep, but remembering that these seasonal foods also need to be local to your environment. So in some parts of the country, tomatoes will come later into summer as you're moving towards fall. Tomatoes as nightshades, I believe, are actually pitta aggravating. But as you start to move towards fall and it gets a little bit cooler and you're preparing the body to move in towards a cold season, that pitta energy is actually going to support you.
And I think this really is, as you say, it can be confusing for people because they might think that Ayurveda is about like eating Indian food or having to follow a vegetarian diet. How does diets like being vegan or vegetarian tie into Ayurveda from your perspective? Do we need to be vegan or vegetarian in order to practice Ayurveda, or can people who eat fish and meat be practicing this ancient science too?
No, so absolutely you can eat meat in an Ayurvedic diet. Like fruits and vegetables, like plants, every creature on this earth is going to have different qualities. So red meat, for instance, is really pitta aggravating. I'll talk a lot about pitta aggravating things because I know a lot about it personally from my own constitution. Meats like chicken and fish are going to be better for people who are pitta predominant. Likewise, people who are kapha, people who already have a lot of earth, a lot of water, probably won't need as much meat because the meat can end up being a little bit heavier. The fat content can, and that can also leave them more towards the kapha end than they need to be. They need to be eating lighter foods.
So it really depends on us understanding our unique constitution. But traditionally, wasn't Ayurvedic, like back in the day, described as vegetarian?
Vegetarian, yep. So the use of ghee and some milks was practiced. And there's a common misinterpretation that an Ayurvedic diet traditionally is the same as a yogic diet, which is avoiding any foods that are stimulating. So that'd be avoiding a yogic diet generally is vegan. If you think about the whole concept of doing no harm, also avoiding anything that would be tamasic or rajasic. So you have like avoiding onions, garlic, chilies, spices. And Ayurveda loves spices. It loves garlic. It loves onion. It uses them as medicine to treat vikriti, to support the person's constitution.
So this is confusing for people, like what we're describing as a yogic diet, and because Ayurveda is described as the sister science of yoga, right? But what you're saying here, which I think is helpful as a clarification for everyone, is that what's often described as a yogic diet quite different from an Ayurvedic diet.
Yeah, exactly.
That's confusing.
I know it is. But I mean, I don't think, so Ayurveda is generally preparing your body for the practice of yoga. I mean, this is just one perspective that I was taught from one teacher, but Ayurveda is preparing your body for optimal health so that you can start to move through your system, eventually reaching your divine energy that exists within you at all times. So I know like in Kundalini yoga, we talk a lot about how Kundalini rests at the base of the spine. And as you work through your practice, you raise that Kundalini energy, Shiva and Shakti whirl or twirl around your spine up Sushumna Nadi until they reach each other, until you eventually reach your enlightenment or your dissolution with the divine.
Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as we talk about this more, I'm curious, is the Ayurvedic diet sort of the optimal diet, as you said, for someone who wants to practice yoga and be in optimal health? And then maybe that yogic diet, the vegan diet, is more specifically for someone who's really trying to reach enlightenment and raise Kundalini? Could that be one understanding of it?
That's how I would see it. Yes.
Okay, that's interesting because that jives. I had a really amazing guest on the show a couple weeks ago who was talking about Shaktipat and raising Kundalini energy in that way, transmission from teacher to student. Sivana listeners, if you haven't listened to that episode, I highly recommend it. It's fascinating, but he was very pro-vegan diet. I mean, he really felt that if you wanted to really raise Kundalini energy and almost have like an awakened, ecstatic, enlightened experience, that a vegan diet was almost a prerequisite to that.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's interesting. I've heard people say that a vegan diet, one of the reasons it doesn't work for a lot of bodies, why a lot of people end up becoming, not a lot of people, but some people can end up becoming anemic and losing too much weight and lose their fertility cycle or lose their ovulation, because veganism can be super Vata provoking. And Kundalini yoga is a practice, it's said to also be very Vata provoking. And Vata is our ether and our air. It's like our connection to everything creative that exists within our world.
So you've used some really cool terms here, like pitta aggravating and vata provoking. And I'm sure the listeners like me, like, oh, I want to know more. So let's start with maybe vata, just because you were just mentioning it. So what other things do you consider, like, because people are listening and they probably have some idea of their Ayurvedic constitution. For example, maybe they know they're vata dominant or they're, a pitta vata combo, which is what I am. If you are aware of that, what are some things based on your expertise that you think people should either do or avoid? Like, what's vata provoking? Like, if we have too much vata already.
Okay, so if you think about your environment, vata provoking would be really dry environments that don't have a lot of moisture. It's also moving a lot. So if you travel, if you're constantly changing your position in the region, if you're going from country to country, that can be really stimulating to vata. I think of vata as movement. Again, it's that creative potential that's constantly flowing and flying around. So for people who have that imbalance and have that constant movement, it's good for them to slow down. It's good for them to take on some weight, to eat some heavier, denser, really deeply nourishing foods, like bringing in ghee to someone who has a really high vata aggravation, or coconut oil if they don't eat dairy products. I think that could be really beneficial. Also, just encouraging stillness. I think to some degree, people who are vata predominant, because I would think I was very vata predominant as a child, and I needed a lot of exercise. Like I needed to get my movement out in a constructive way before I could even come to sit. I think people who have that vata predominant energy or imbalance, it's good for them to get in some light exercise, work up a light sweat, but then take time for stillness. So moving towards a meditation practice would be huge. Moving towards restorative yoga, even if that feels challenging for them because they want to fidget and move, can be really beneficial. And adding sandbags over their hips can be really helpful. Just really feeling into the weight of the earth.
Love sandbags. Yes. Sandbags in your yoga practice, everyone. Hugely, hugely beneficial. So, okay. So if we have a lot of vata, we maybe don't want to live in the desert. We maybe don't want to jet set on planes, all the time, even if we want to, and maybe slowing down and finding stillness and then eating some of those heavier foods. So can you give some examples of foods that people who have a lot of vata should maybe eat and which ones they should avoid?
Yeah. So again, it depends on dietary preferences. I'm not going to tell anyone who's a vegan that they need to be eating meat. I'm not a nutritionist or dietitian, but healthy fats are really beneficial for vata. Also avoiding dry foods. So any chips, any snacky things, getting in those good fats and making sure that their food is warm. Ayurveda in general likes warm food because that fits better with your the temperature of your body. So it's easier to digest, but especially for vata. So like really rich stews with maybe some dark leafy greens, some nutrient rich lentils, that can be really beneficial. And also making sure to have a steady meal in the beginning of the day. I think vata people are like constantly on the go. A lot of them don't really have a strong diet. So engaging that diet first thing in the morning, maybe by having some lemon water, doing their yoga practice, and then having some really warm, nutrient-rich food like quinoa porridge or oatmeal can be really helpful. If they do eat meat, maybe breakfast would be an okay time to add in some meat or cook your eggs or whatever with a little bit of ghee instead of oil.
I love all those suggestions. Okay, so I think this is really helpful. I'm learning, and I think this is really beneficial for folks who, they're just looking for some practical tips. So let's talk about pitta now. How would you describe what you called before things that are pitta aggravating, whether it's things we're doing or things we're eating?
Yeah, so I think of pittas. I'm not complete. I have a lot of pitta, especially when I'm in an academic setting, as I guess you do too. But I think of pitta as like type A, hardworking, fire in the mind, fire in the body. It's going to be people who tend towards more like upset stomach, a little bit of indigestion and acidity kind of burning at all times. It's also going to be people who have a tendency towards a pinkish undertone in their skin. People who tend to be, kind of continuously have a light sweat on their skin or a soft oiliness to their skin. People who have kind of thin or oily hair, and people who are easily frustrated. So I see that a lot with pitta people, that their natural reaction when they're feel at all frustrated is to get angry or to get aggressive. They're like the warriors in our culture. They're the go-getters. They're going to fight for what they want. They're going to be the ones that are hardest to have a disagreement with. And pitta aggravating things are anything else that bring on that fire element. So I think it's great for pittas to remove themselves from super competitive environment, to work on self-reflection, to work on stillness, much like with a Vata predominant person, to work on just being at ease and letting that fire kind of cool down a little bit.
And what does that mean in terms of food for them?
Yeah, pittas, I would avoid. I just had an Ayurvedic practitioner actually tell me that red meat isn't always pitta aggravating in moderation. But if you tend to eat red meat once a day or a few times a week, I would reduce it to maybe once a week. Again, of course, check in with your healthcare provider if you have any ongoing conditions. But removing red meat, if it's a regular staple in your diet, especially if it's one of the first things you eat in the morning.
What else? You mentioned the tomatoes as well, or was that something different?
Yeah, so nightshades can be aggravating to pitta. That includes like eggplant, things that have, spices in moderation are great. Ayurveda loves spices, but avoiding anything that's too spicy. So people with a pitta aggravation, as the pitta aggravation gets deeper and deeper, they can end up towards ulcers or lean more towards ulcers. So avoiding anything that would irritate that acidity. So coffee is really pitta aggravating. It's also Vata aggravating, but chili peppers, any food that has a lot of spice or a lot of heavy oil, fried foods.
Interesting. What's your take on caffeine in general, and then as it relates to pittas, because I'm curious?
Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with coffee. I'll just start by saying that. I'm actually about to write a whole post on the coffee beans. And if you look at the coffee bean, or if you look at the coffee cherry, as a plant, it's really vibrant and red. And the minute I see red, I just instantly think pitta, because the fire, the sun, that heat. And it depends on how your system handles it. So again, it's not just about what I would be telling you today, but you really tune into how your system is responding to the foods, the nourishment that you take in. So if you have a pitta aggravation, Ayurveda loves talking about poop. That's a whole nother topic. But you're going to have bowel movements that are really loose and kind of uncomfortable instead of like steady and healthy. And if you're experiencing that bowel movement after you have coffee on a regular basis, or if the coffee is kind of like adding into that uncomfortable acidity or heartburn, that is a chance to really recognize that coffee is aggravating your system. But some people don't have that. Some people can do great with a cup of coffee in the morning. It doesn't affect their digestive tract. It's not affecting their metabolism. It doesn't make them anxious. Then it's fine. I think if it makes you feel good, if it helps you to thrive, it's a medicine in that way.
Well, this is interesting what you're saying, because I think a lot of people that I know use coffee as a way to stimulate that bowel movement. That becomes like something they're almost dependent on, right? And what you're saying is, if that's the case, that's actually a signal that your body is irritated by the coffee. Is that right?
Yeah. So too much coffee can end up leading to constipation. So your body has a harder time producing a healthy bowel. I encourage people who've drinking coffee their whole life, like me, who's been drinking it since I was 16, to just take a week off. The first few days kind of suck, because it's really hard to like get through your day without that stimulant, but let your body kind of get used to moving about without coffee, and maybe wait a couple of days, start eating some like really nutrient rich foods, focus on that, and see what happens to your bowel movement, see what happens to your stomach. Maybe you notice that your appetite's different throughout the day. With me, I noticed when I removed coffee, I was able to really tune into what my body needed. So like constantly having that stimulant in my system made it harder for me to recognize what kind of foods I needed. And when I was able to cut coffee out, I could really feel when I needed a heavy, dense protein, when I needed to eat, instead of skipping meals, snacking on light foods, snacking on foods that were bad for my constitution.
So if people are dependent on that coffee, their bowel movement stimulation each day, that is not the intention of what coffee is supposed to be doing for them.
No, coffee is a medicine. I think it can be great when it's used in moderation, but it is not meant to be used every day.
Okay, fascinating. So I'm glad we covered that because I think pitta people like their coffee a lot because they want to get up and go. All right, now let's talk about kapha. Are there foods that are kapha aggravating?
Yeah. So I think of kaphas as like the big teddy bears. They're the people who are really likely to give you a hug, hold you in, and just make you feel loved. They're the people who tend towards like really beautiful, healthy curves, big, heartwarming eyes, soft, thick, lustrous hair, big lip. They just really look like they're filled with earth. Just kind of like happy and healthy and grounded, very calm, very relaxed. People who have a kapha imbalance, or people who are people who are kapha predominant in the first place, who lean more towards a kapha imbalance, tend to gain too much weight, tend to be too stationary, too relaxed. They're not going to want to get up and get off the couch. They're not going to want to be very active. They're also going to get pretty attached emotionally. So they're going to hold on to relationships. They're going to hold on to emotions for long periods of time. It's just like this really heavy sense.
So what do these folks need to move towards or avoid in terms of their environment and the food they're taking in?
Yeah, so I think it's great. I think people who are kapha predominant, it's great for them to move. That doesn't have to be like a crazy workout every day. I wouldn't look at it as a weight thing. I would look at it as like a how do you feel thing. If you feel kind of like burnt out or lazy or just unexcited about life, I think getting out there and doing something that makes you excited about life again is great. So going to a dance class, I think is really nice. I love movement as therapy. I think that's huge. And it's also social. And there's something really deeply spiritual about dancing, which I think kaphas would connect to. And the social aspect is huge. Swimming can be great, especially if someone's having a lot of weight issues. Just that low impact exercise can be really nice for the body. If they feel ready to go in to a yoga class, I think kapha people can benefit from hot yoga. I wouldn't do it every day because that can be really aggravating to your system, but going into a yoga class that really encourages a good sweat. And if they're not doing hot yoga, something where they can like make themselves work until they start to feel a light sweat. That's a really healthy sensation.
And you talked about people who are Vata really needing those earthy, grounding, warm foods. Now, is the inverse true for someone with kapha?
Kaphas, I would encourage them to eat more room temperature foods. I mean, Ayurveda likes warm food over cold food in general. It doesn't really recommend the use of cold foods. But I think kaphas could use a little bit more spice in their life. So foods with a little bit more flavor, not just like a beef stew, but maybe a chili, maybe a curry, maybe some Thai food with some good peppers in there.
It's so interesting that Ayurveda really isn't a fan of cold food at all. So for you, as someone who's so knowledgeable about this, like when you make smoothies or you're cooking things that are traditionally eaten cold, do you advise your clients to kind of wait for them to be at room temperature?
So I think the most heartbreaking part of my Ayurveda training was when my instructor told me that we should not be drinking smoothies anymore.
So tell us about that, because that's kind of heartbreaking news for, I think, a lot of people.
Yeah. So smoothies are cold. Generally, they have a mixture of foods that are incompatible in the first place. Like Ayurveda there's a whole different series of lists on incompatible foods. And one of them is fruits and vegetables. And generally, especially in our like holistic green living culture as yogis, people love to put kale and spinach and collard greens in their smoothies on top of the banana or the sweet fruit, the strawberries, the mangoes. And those foods digest at a different rate. So putting them together in your digestive system can actually mess things up a little bit and really disturb the way your body's processing them. In addition, a lot of people put bananas in their food, and bananas are really sticky and heavy. And on top of that coldness, that can just add a lot of mucus and dampness to your system. The best time to have a smoothie is in the summer. The worst time to have a smoothie is in the winter, especially if you tend towards like sinus congestion, mucus in your system. I would just avoid smoothies altogether, which I know is hard because especially people who have a lot going on like me, it's really good to just like throw some healthy food in a blender and pop out the door. But I think it's a good lesson on taking time to really prepare food for yourself, to sit down, indulging in a meal that maybe takes a little bit longer to make.
This is so interesting, and I think it's really important. And it's a concept I want to make sure that we really touch on for listeners, because I've heard this from other Ayurvedic practitioner friends of mine as well, this idea that combining different types of food together, whether it's in a smoothie or even just like the idea of a meat on your plate that has, like a great example is like a salad that has like it's the steak salad, right? So it has like greens and meat and maybe some blueberries and, it sounds really great. But like you said, leafy greens and meat and berries are all treated very differently by our digestive tract. So by eating them as a combo, like as the steak salad, it's kind of like the same idea as the smoothie, right? And that we could really all benefit potentially in this Ayurvedic perspective from sort of, I don't know what the right term is, Izzy, so maybe you can remind me, but it's like mono eating or something, right? Like only eating one thing at a time.
Like a mono diet?
Yeah. What's a mono diet? I think that's what I'm talking about.
So mono diets, which actually Ayurveda use sometimes, is just subscribing to one thing, or at least the way I've been taught. So in Ayurveda, a lot of times if someone's having digestive issues, they will have a mono diet of khichdi recommended, or maybe they'll do a 1-day juice cleanse to just clear out their system so that the body's not constantly reassessing at what speed it needs to be digesting food. It just has one simple food that it can focus on.
And even if someone doesn't want to do a khichdi cleanse or a full-on mono diet, do you think there's a benefit in this idea of I eat my steak and then a couple of hours later I eat a salad that's just a salad, like as opposed to combining the two, or not really?
No, I think that can be great. I think also, but I also wouldn't eat a steak as a whole meal. So that's a lot of meat. I think having little bits of steak with maybe some cooked vegetables is a much healthier option.
Interesting. So is that because then both foods are cooked, that it's like easier for the digestive system to sort of handle them both at once? Is that the idea?
Yeah, definitely more than raw greens, like a raw salad.
And does Ayurveda ever say like, yay, raw stuff?
Yeah. So Ayurveda loves juices as, it's its own type of medicine to give someone a juice cleanse, and practitioners use that pretty sparingly. But some people who have tend towards constipation, or it just feels like they've had so much bad food in their system, sometimes they'll have like a 1-day juice cleanse to just clear it out.
Interesting, but that's almost like the juice is an extreme medicinal type of thing rather than like we should be having orange juice every morning with our breakfast type of thing.
No, and you don't want to be having orange juice with your breakfast because that is high on the glycemic index.
Yes, exactly.
Blood sugar.
But this is really interesting, and I'm wondering if you have any practical tips for listeners and myself about this no smoothie thing. Like, what have you been using instead of the smoothie? I mean, I'm a huge Vitamix junkie, love my Vitamix. It's probably like one of the top 3 items I'd take with me on a desert island. And I'm already thinking like, you can whip up soups pretty easily in the Vitamix as opposed to a smoothie, like just some simple soups. Do you have any other ideas or like simple recipes that you love?
There's a juice bar here in town that makes these nut milks, and they're actually pretty simple, but makes these really delicious nut milks with like cacao and dates and cashew and pink Himalayan salt and maybe some spirulina. And they're not cold, so they're like just maybe a little bit cooler than room temperature. And they're great. They're made fresh every day, and I think that's a great alternative. I think it's kind of like a nut smoothie a nut, what's that word? Milkshake.
Yeah, I was going to say latte.
Milkshake, but not as cold. And they're really delicious. And I mean, you get some good protein in there. It's pretty easy for the body to digest. It's really hearty.
What's the deal with having to soak nuts before you eat them? Is that an Ayurvedic practice, or does that come from somewhere else, and how important is it? Because I feel like people hear about that, right? Like you need to soak your almonds before you ingest them or something like that.
So I don't know that it's specifically an Ayurvedic thing. I've always heard of it from macrobiotic chefs, just because it's a way of kind of giving food new life. Like if you think about sprouting beans, it just kind of softens them and opens them up and makes it easier for your body to process them.
I love it. So again, it's making your digestive fire have to do a little bit less work, which is a good thing. Gives us more energy to do all the other things we're doing. Okay, amazing. And now tying all of this back to this idea of sustainability that I know you're so passionate about, it seems like the key takeaway is that we just need to eat locally. Like it's not so much about being vegan or vegetarian or pescatarian or anything like that. It's just about really eating the fruits, vegetables, potentially fish and meat as well, that is kind of in season, regardless of our dosha. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a fan of this for so many reasons. Sustainability is a big part of it. Eating local is huge because, of course, it reduces the use of fossil fuels. It's also a great way of connecting with people in your community. So going into your community, supporting local farmers, getting to meet them, facilitating that connection actually makes the whole process of receiving nutrients more mindful, because there's so much that goes into this food. There's this social aspect, this aspect of love as you're picking the food for yourself from the farmer's market, as you're taking it home, as you're cutting it up, as you're creating this really nutrient-rich meal and you're doing the dishes. It's this whole meditation on love.
So we can meditate as we cook and we clean up. Do you have any little tips for us on how to do that or how you're doing it? Like how to tap into a state of meditation when we're shopping or cleaning?
Yeah, tuning out any TV, which I know is hard, or radio, having it be like a one focused task. So instead of doing multiple things at once, I would really take the time to cook for yourself. Even if you can't do it every night of the week, at least doing it twice, like planning to make 2 really good home cooked meals, giving yourself time to prep the food. Maybe you do it with somebody you care about. Maybe you're cooking for people you care about. Turn off the radio, turn off the music and the TV, and just be present in the process of chopping the vegetables and rinsing the vegetables and putting everything in the stove and smelling the spices, even taste the spices before you put them in the food. It would all be really nice.
I think that's a great tip because I know for me when I'm cooking, I often feel very overwhelmed and that the recipe is actually asking me to do a lot of things at the same time. So I think this idea of like deliberately slowing down and saying, okay, I'm just going to tackle this one piece at a time is a really important reminder.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So Izzy, we're having you back on the show to talk about pregnancy. So anyone who is thinking of getting pregnant or currently pregnant, you're absolutely going to want to tune into Thursday's episode because we get to pick Izzy's brain about all things Ayurveda as it also relates to pregnancy and actually having an unmedicated birth, if that's something that you're interested in. But Izzy, for the people who maybe aren't tuning in on Thursday, how can people find, connect, work with you locally and online? Because our listeners are all over.
Yeah, I would love that if everybody wanted to stay in touch. My business is called Holistic Birth and Wellness. I have a website. It's www.holisticbirthandwellness.com. I also have an Instagram page where I'll periodically post little Ayurvedic or pregnancy tidbits, and that's the same name, just Holistic Birth and Wellness.
And do you do Ayurvedic consults for people as well?
I do, absolutely. So I can do those over Skype or Zoom and pay via PayPal and Venmo, and we'll do a traditional consultation face-to-face over the camera. And then I'll have some time to put together your case and send you on with a list of recommendations, and where I'm available to meet as many times as they need after the initial session.
Izzy, thank you so much for coming on the show. Sivana listeners, let me know what you thought of today's episode. Did you learn some interesting things about Ayurveda that you didn't know before? I'm always looking forward to your requests and your feedback. And for those of you that are pregnant or trying to conceive or interested in the birth world, tune into Thursday's episode. We're going to be talking about yoginis and natural childbirth. People in the yoga world, myself included, feel a tremendous amount of pressure a lot of the time to go for a natural birth. So in Thursday's episode, Izzy's going to really walk us through what natural birth means. She's going to offer up this term unmedicated birth instead, which is really interesting. And she's going to talk us through how the best birth preparation really involves tuning into our own body awareness. And she's going to give us concrete tips on exactly how to do that. She's also going to cover the challenges that can arise in birth, specifically for women who do yoga, and how to navigate birth and postpartum grace. Do not miss Thursday's episode if you're pregnant or considering conceiving soon. Thank you so much for tuning in, for listening, and so much love. From my heart to yours, namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to SivanaSpirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at Facebook.com/Sivana Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at SivanaEast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode. And thank you for listening to the Sivana podcast.